a worker breathes, asbestos fibers enter the mouth and nose and flow down the air passages deep into the lungs. The fibers lodge in the delicate lung tissue where oxygen is absorbed into the blood. Immune system cells try and break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells and spreads as more fibers embed in the lungs. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working. Since the year 2000, more workers have died from asbestos disease than any other workplace injury.
Mesothelioma is a rare form of cancer that lines a person's organs and is the result of lead paint and asbestos exposure and rarely radiation exposure. Smoking does not cause mesothelioma. Throughout the 20th century, millions of tons of asbestos were mined in our country and put in thousands of products. Asbestos was very inexpensive and was used as a filler in cements, drywall muds, brake and clutch linings, roof shingles, gaskets, flooring products, paints, textiles, and insulation. The companies that used asbestos knew as early as 1925 that asbestos was dangerous to the workers, to their families, and to the public. The companies commissioned medical studies that revealed these dangers, but these same companies chose profits over safety and hid these studies. They provided no warnings about the dangers, and as a result, thousands of Americans have been killed by asbestos. Sadly, in the United States, asbestos use increased dramatically as other properties of asbestos were recognized. For example, asbestos was used as a filler in many plastics and adhesives on tiles. Asbestos was used in paper production in order to obtain a higher grade of paper with a lower grade of pulp. Immediately before and after World War II, brakes, clutches, building plasters, cements, shingles, insulation, drywall joint compounds, and textured paints commonly contained asbestos. In the United States in 1917, Dr. Henry K. Pancoast of the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine observed lung scarring in the x-rays of 15 asbestos factory workers. In 1918, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics published a report by an insurance statistician noting the unusually early deaths of asbestos workers and revealing that it had become a common practice for insurers to deny coverage for workers because of the assumed health injurious conditions in the asbestos industry. By the 1930s, asbestos manufacturers and their insurance companies knew that asbestos was killing workers at alarming rates. In 1934, Aetna Insurance Company published the Attorney's Textbook of Medicine, which devoted a full chapter to asbestos exposure, noting that asbestosis was incurable and usually results in permanent disability followed by death. In the book, Outrageous Misconduct, The Asbestos Industry on Trial, the author showed that nothing proves the culpability of the asbestos manufacturers in the death and injury of asbestos workers quite like internal documents from the companies themselves. These papers, just a handful of which are shown here for the first time on national television, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the companies and their insurers knew the hazards of asbestos and concealed this information from workers for decades. More than any other piece of evidence, it is the company's own internal papers that have convinced juries of citizens across the country that workers and their families deserve compensation to help them manage the severe and often fatal health consequences of working with asbestos. The push by defendant industries to establish a national asbestos victims trust fund was driven in large part by the fact that courts consistently find asbestos companies guilty, not just of exposing their workers to a substance, asbestos, that could kill or severely injure them, but of doing this with full knowledge of the fatal consequences of their actions, and of actively concealing this truth from these same workers. I quote, "The 1966 documents of the Director of Purchasing for Bendix Corporation, now a part of Honeywell, which capture the complete disregard of an industry for its workforce that is expressed over and over again in company documents spanning the past 60 years. If you have enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it?" In court cases after court cases, insurance and manufacturing company documents were made public through litigation. These papers reveal a brazen disregard for the men and women who by the 1960s were dying by the thousands each year for these businesses, a history of abuse and deception that is unparalleled in American industrial history. In large measure, it is the written words of these company executives that have convinced juries across America those workers and their families deserve full compensation for their suffering. In 1980, the American Insurance Association predicted that there will be between 8,000 and 13,000 claims a year from asbestos-caused cancer from 1977 through 1995. In 1968, the Travelers Insurance Company concluded that they faced major financial exposure from deaths due to non-occupational asbestos exposure near asbestos manufacturing facilities. That conclusion was confirmed when a Manville attorney informed the Travelers that, confidentially, John's Manville has been contaminating the hell out of both the water and the air for quite some time. Dr. Smith, medical director of John's Manville, explained the corporate politics in the following words, and I quote, "It is felt that as long as the man feels well, is happy at home and at work, and his physical condition remains good, nothing should be said. When he becomes disabled and sick, then the diagnosis should be made in the claims submitted by the company. The fibrosis of this disease is irreversible and permanent, so that eventually compensation will be paid to each of these men. But as long as the man is not disabled, it is felt that he should not be told of his condition so that he can live and work in peace and the company can benefit by his many years of experience." Van Diver Brown, former general counsel of John's Manville Legal Department, summarized this even further when asked the following question, "Mr. Brown, do you mean to tell me that you would let them work until they drop dead?" "Yes, we save a lot of money that way." A 1974 memo from Exxon declares, "Not only are we violating the existing regulations concerning clothing by not providing such clothing and laundering it, but we are also failing to protect our employees and the families of our employees from asbestos exposure." The goal of the Travelers Catastrophic Products Committee was to study the potential for asbestos to wipe out the company's assets, and then, in the company's own words, make the catastrophe reducible to a level which would not imperil the assets of Travelers. The question was how to do it. The decision on the part of the insurers was to adopt the same strategy as producers: deny prior knowledge and admit no liability. In 1977, the insurance industry's discussion group on asbestosis unanimously decided not to admit liability in asbestosis cases. And I quote from their own documents, "The meeting closed with a unanimous rejection of a suggestion that liability in asbestosis cases be admitted." In a 1970 W.R. Grace memo regarding sales of its monocoat fireproofing spray product, which contained 12% asbestos, an employee urged, "Stay unscrupulous, unethical, mean, and selling monocoat." A 1972 Union Carbide memorandum instructed managers to handle inquiries from concerned customers aggressively, and I quote, "If the customer is persistent and threatens to eliminate asbestos, a certain amount of aggressiveness may be effective." Words and catchphrases such as premature, irrational, or avoiding the inevitable will sometimes turn the table. The main objective is to keep the customer on the defensive, make him justify his position. A 1981 Dow internal memo marked confidential had the following note scrawled across the top by a worried executive. "We are in trouble and would be more so if we had an investigation. We need a crash program." In this Insider Exclusive Investigative Network TV special, we go behind the headlines in Mesothelioma Myra Williams' story to examine how Jeff Gaughan, partner at Baggett, McCall, Burgess, Watson, and Gaughan Law, successfully represented the Williams family in the wrongful and tragic death of Myra Williams. Myra Williams died at the age of 59 on August 9, 2003 as a result of mesothelioma. She left behind her husband of many decades and their 4 children. Myra was married to Jimmy Williams Sr., who she had known since they were teenagers. Jimmy operated natural gas compressors in the compressor room of a plant run by Placid Oil Company for several years during the 1970s. Jimmy's work involved crawling around on the compressors to take readings and change out asbestos gaskets, as well as just being in the compressor building when the air was thick from dust as a result of the vibrating compressors causing a great deal of asbestos fiber to accumulate on his clothes. Myra washed Jimmy's work clothes when he came home in the evening, and in the process of doing so, inhaled the asbestos fibers that caused her to contract the fatal disease. The compressors were manufactured by Ingersoll Rand, whose operating specifications for the machine specified the asbestos insulation and gaskets, for which Ingersoll Rand provided replacements as requested. Myra Williams developed mesothelioma over 20 years after she was exposed to the asbestos fibers in her husband's clothes. Neither the insulation nor the original or replacement gaskets warned of the health risks associated with asbestos exposure, even though those risks had been well known and identified by OSHA, and Ingersoll Rand had been placing such warnings on its compressors and asbestos products provided to the U.S. Navy since the 1950s. The greatest challenges presented by these facts was, of course, the fact that Myra Williams did not work on the compressors or around all of the asbestos. Her husband, Jimmy, did. So the Williams lawyers had to show that Jimmy's work clothes were the obvious and only source of the asbestos fibers that ultimately took Myra's life. They were able to successfully do that by showing that there was no other known source of asbestos exposure in Myra's environment. The Williams lawyers provided that the failure of Ingersoll Rand to warn the workers at the Placid Oil plant was the ultimate cause of Myra Williams' death, and that had the warning been given, Myra Williams, who was otherwise in excellent health, would probably still be with her family today. Jeff has earned the highest respect from citizens and lawyers alike as one of the best trial lawyers in Lake Charles and Louisiana. He has seen many innocent and hardworking people become victims of intentional corporate wrongdoing. And because of that, he and his law firm are driven to fight for people who have been harmed by the willful or negligent actions of others. Their goals, not only to get justice for their clients, but to make sure that corporations respect and protect the health and the safety of all their workers. This is the Insider Exclusive, live from Lake Charles, Louisiana. It is my great pleasure to introduce Jeff Gaughan to the show. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Thank you.
Tell our audience a little bit about your firm.
Baggett McCall has been in existence for over 50 years. And in those 50 years, we have exclusively represented injured families, injured people.
Little people.
Little people.
Yeah. And not companies.
I can't remember a time that I ever represented a company.
So why do you make that choice? Because, you know, it's a tough road sometimes to pursue, isn't it?
It was a choice that really wasn't offered to me in law school. In fact, in law school, they gear you towards representing, in my mind, the big corporation.
Yes.
I had the opportunity when I graduated from school to be exposed. And my first exposure actually was legal aid. And legal aid is, the concept where you represent people that really can't afford to pay you at all.
Right.
And from that, I parlayed that and said to myself, hey, you get more satisfaction. You can go home at the end of the day. You can sit back and say to yourself, you really helped somebody.
Right.
When I used to represent corporations in law school during the summer breaks, you never really got that feeling at the end of the day. You felt like, hey, I made some money, but I really didn't do anybody any good.
Was there ever something conveyed to you when you were representing in law school corporations that, hey, this person doesn't matter? And besides that, if you give that person a lot of money, it'll set a precedent for other people who really don't have legitimate claims to sue us too, which is bad for business.
Well, and you hear that. I heard that then. I hear it now.
Yeah.
I think we all, if we turn the TV on nowadays, you hear that. If you listen to the politicians and see bills or laws that are trying to be passed, they're all geared towards saying, hey, there's somebody out there trying to fleece money from legitimate companies.
Yeah.
Well, that may well happen, but at the end of the day, what I've seen in 25 years of doing this and representing these people is they're the ones that have the problems.
Right.
They're the ones that need the income to survive. Corporations don't need the money to survive. We all know that.
Right, right. And besides that, any verdict that they get, any settlement that they get, they write it off as the cost of doing business, right?
They probably wrote it off before the suit was even brought in front of a court.
Yeah. So today we are here because of the case of Myra Williams, correct?
Yes.
Which I call a secondary mesothelioma case,
Absolutely.
of which your firm does a lot of mesothelioma or asbestos-related cases, right?
We do, and unfortunately we do.
Tell our audience a little bit about who Myra Williams was.
The sad part of this, Steve, is that Myra Williams was a regular housewife.
Yeah.
She raised 4 children, never worked outside the home.
Yeah.
Her husband, in the traditional nuclear family, worked for 35 years at the same location.
He worked at Placid Oil, right?
Placid Oil had a facility outside of Natchitoches, Louisiana. Myra, unfortunately for me, which is one of the downfalls for me of this case, is I never had the chance to meet Myra. I was actually in my car halfway between here and Lake Charles and her house when her daughter called and told me she had passed away.
Yes.
Everything I've ever learned about Myra came from her husband, Jimmy, and their 4 children.
And what kind of job? Jimmy worked at Placid Oil. He's the one that he was working around asbestos material.
He was.
And the fibers would get in his hair, on his clothes, correct?
Every day.
Okay. And he would go home bringing these clothes with the fibers, which Myra washed, correct? And she inhaled some of these fibers because they're, basically you can't see them, right?
Every day he did that.
Yeah.
5-6 days a week.
Now, the real crux of this issue, of this whole case is, what warning, if any, did Placid Oil, his employer, give to the workers there that would advise them to say, change your clothes, take a shower, do something, but don't bring these clothes home? Absolutely nothing. They did nothing. And yet, Placid Oil and is it Ingersoll Rand who manufactured the product that had the asbestos, right?
Compressors.
They were warning people in the U.S. Navy of the problems with potential mesothelioma or asbestos-related diseases back in the 1950s. Is that right?
Ingersoll Rand did business with the Navy in the 50s.
Yeah.
And as part of their contracts with the Navy in the 1950s, it required them to inform the workers of the dangers of asbestos.
So it amazes me why they didn't inform the rest of the public. Workers who were not in the U.S. Navy, but were working as civilians or with the same type of equipment.
Oh, and even more tragically, their families.
Yeah. Well, why didn't they? Did that ever come out?
Well, we can assume that the primary reason that the companies didn't inform is probably a monetary consideration. You would have had to protect those workers in some form or fashion from the exposures.
Yeah.
Now, in reality, furnishing the workers with a place to change their clothes, furnishing them with a respirator before they left the premises would have cost literally nothing.
I think I mentioned to you, I covered another case, Amanda Satterfield in Tennessee.
I saw that one.
Yeah. And it was a similar case. The daughter died in this case.
Yeah.
Same thing, inhaled the fibers. How do these fibers, and by the way, the defendant in the case was Alcoa.
Okay.
And Alcoa's claim was, hey, this young lady never stepped foot on our premises, so we don't owe her anything. The Tennessee State Supreme Court thought otherwise,
Sure.
and they settled the case, which was unfortunate because she was only 25 years old.
Well, whether it's Alcoa or Placid or Ingersoll Rand, they all owe a duty not only to the worker, but to the family to furnish a safe place to work.
Okay, now, have you handled other cases of people who contracted mesothelioma working at this same plant?
No, this was the first one at this plant.
Placid Oil.
Placid Oil.
How about other companies in this area?
We have. There are many refineries and petrochemical plants in the Lake Charles area, and we have represented numerous children, wives, and of course the workers.
And that have all died too?
Absolutely.
Children. How old were the children?
Unfortunately, the youngest child that we had that passed away was only a few years older than me, in her mid-50s.
Wow. So, do you know for a fact whether they posted signs now?
Posted signs now or back in the day?
Yeah. No, now, after your case.
Well, the Placid Oil facility did post signs, but the signs were not posted until well into the 1990s.
Right. And that was after he had worked there a number of years.
Jimmy Williams had already worked at that facility for 35 years.
Yeah. How does mesothelioma kill somebody? How does it cause their death?
Everyone knows and has heard of somebody with lung cancer.
Yes.
Lung cancer or mesothelioma is a particular variant of lung cancer that is primarily affecting the lining of the lungs.
Yes.
Our lungs are sitting in a protective cocoon, so to speak.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, what asbestos will do, it enters the body through the mouth or the nose, and it rests or resides in that lining of the lungs.
Right.
No one's ever going to be able to know the reason why in a particular individual, whether it's you, me, or Myra Williams, why it is that the lining of the lungs becomes inflamed, and thereafter that inflammation turns into a cancer.
Yeah, because it is carcinogenic.
Absolutely.
Right. And how long after you're diagnosed with mesothelioma do you normally live?
The normal survival period from the time of diagnosis is 6 to 12 months.
Wow. That's pretty fast.
It's
Does a person notice any change in their health prior to the diagnosis?
Well, that's the insidious nature of asbestos in and of itself, is that person that eventually is diagnosed with mesothelioma and has 6 to 12 months to live, the only problem they'll experience is probably some shortness of breath.
Yeah.
But you and I can climb the stairs and get a shortness of breath. We're not going to know until it's too late, until it's spread too far. What's going on?
You've handled a lot of these cases, and I just can't imagine putting myself in your situation. And when these people come into your office and they already have their diagnosis, don't they? What is it? How do they act? What is it like dealing with them? I mean, you're sitting across from somebody who knows they're going to be dead in 6 to 12 months.
You know, the thing that I've noticed from representing far too many of these people, these families. There's a part of human nature that comes out, as terrible as it is. You know, it's basically a death sentence.
Yeah.
I mean, the family knows it, you know it. You're sitting there trying to have a normal conversation with somebody that's not going to be here in a year.
Yeah.
But human nature, the way it is, these families always try to look for the positive. They know that they have a period of time left with their father, their mother, whoever it may be. And they try to do the best they can with that time.
Well, like in this case, Placid Oil. Were they angry with Placid Oil?
For a period of time, the children were angry.
Yeah.
To the credit of Jimmy Williams.
How about Jimmy?
Jimmy Williams was that type of individual who saw the good part. He had 40 years with Myra as husband and wife. He tried to spend that last year caring for her and doing all the things that basically she did for him because he was the breadwinner. He was the one that went to work every day to put food on the table, put the kids through school. But for once in his life, and he tried to do the best he could.
Right.
You've never seen Jimmy Williams cry until that day in the courtroom where he had to give testimony and talk about his wife.
Yeah. A lot of times cases take years to get to trial, if you bring it to trial.
Yes.
Okay. With asbestos-related disease cases, I understand there's an expedited time frame that you can get a resolution on a case because the diagnosis between when you get the diagnosis and the time that you die is so short.
Luckily, the courts give special consideration to people that only have certain time to live.
Yeah.
And we can ordinarily get a case of an individual diagnosed with mesothelioma to trial within 6 months.
Yeah. There is over the years, there's been many cases of mesothelioma as well, settlements, and asbestosis settlements. There's been a fund that was set aside, I think, initially by Johns Manville, correct? And I think, if I remember correctly, something like 40 some other defendants. Is that fund still active? Is it still there? Is there still money in it?
The fund is still active for each of those 40 companies.
Yeah.
Those 40 companies, and you mentioned Johns Manville, they were all primarily involved in the manufacture of different asbestos products. And we're talking about products going back to the 1940s.
Yeah.
The companies such as Placid are typically not part of those funds because they're essentially the premise owner. They're the company that the individual worked at.
Right.
What we try to do here at Baggett McCall is, if there's a claim for you to have against a plant, against a premises, we pursue that first to the extent we can pursue it in a court of law.
Mm-hmm.
If that's not possible, we can always attempt to file claims with those trusts that have been created for the bankrupt companies.
Okay. So you have two options to go to.
You do.
Can you explain to our audience, there's people out there that are suffering from asbestosis and mesothelioma, and those are the two, I guess, asbestos-related diseases. Is that correct?
Well, asbestos can affect the lungs, obviously, but from an anatomical point of view, asbestos, if we think about it logically, it can affect every portion of the body that it touches.
Yes.
So asbestos has been related to esophageal cancer, laryngeal cancer.
And that's been proven, the link.
It has. Stomach cancer.
Have you handled cases
like
that?
We've handled all of those.
So what is a person's legal rights when they're diagnosed and they know they've been working around asbestos even today?
Well, in this state, for example, in Louisiana, you have 1 year.
Yeah.
So if you and I go to the doctor.
Once you are diagnosed.
Once you're diagnosed.
That's a statute of limitation.
That's it.
Okay.
If you exceed that year, your rights are forever lost. So we try to encourage people, if you're diagnosed, if a doctor tells you, or even suspects, come see us so that we can have it evaluated as quickly as possible.
Right. When you say evaluate the case, evaluate the diagnosis, what?
Well, with any case, what we're going to look at first is your medical records. We're going to see what the doctor has specifically said about you. We're going to look at the work history, whether it's your work history, whether it's your father's work history, whoever may have exposed you, or whatever the avenue was for your exposure to asbestos.
I did another story. I think you may have seen it. It was on Ron Grimes, who worked
I did see that one.
Yeah, he worked in the U.S. Navy. And I think and then later on he worked as a school custodian. And the chemicals that he worked with, like to buff the floor and that kind of stuff, contained asbestos. Now, he wouldn't have had a claim until he had been diagnosed. And by the way, he lived for 4 years after his diagnosis.
That's an incredibly long
time. And that's how we were able to interview him. Yeah. Great guy. He was same age as I was in the whole 9 yards.
Almost universally, even though it's a terrible disease, all the people that I've represented over these years have been terrific individuals.
Yeah.
I mean, just basically heroes going through what they have to go through.
When we first did the research on this story, and we've done quite a few of them like this, I almost blew my top when I saw the documentation that I remember I think it was the general counsel of Johns Manville wrote in a letter, and I think we're going to have it in this show too, but he wrote in a letter, he didn't really care about the health of the workers, because his letter said they lived well by asbestos, they can die by asbestos, quote unquote.
I've read that letter.
Yeah, and it's like, how do these people live with themselves?
Well, that's kind of our job, is we have to protect what rights they have, because obviously the corporations that expose them to the asbestos, or their family members, they didn't care.
In this state, can a person get disability or workers' compensation as a result of not being able to work again if they were working and they were diagnosed with mesothelioma?
That is an avenue we would pursue if it's there.
How about in this state? Because I know some states like Texas has done away with it.
Fortunately for us, Louisiana has not attempted to do that.
Yeah.
If you or I come down with an asbestos-related illness while still employed, you do have workers' compensation rights.
Right. A lot of people don't know this when they hear I have a potential legal case. Lawyers are expensive. And I'd like you to tell our audience, in these type of cases, How does your law firm work?
Well, one of the things I've always prided myself on, Steve, is that not only is it free to talk to me the first time, ordinarily I'm going to come to your house. I'm going to sit down at your kitchen table and I'm going to talk to you like the guy next door.
Right.
And I'm going to tell you, unlike the guy next door, I'm going to tell you what your rights are.
Yeah.
Good or bad, I'm going to tell you what you can do. I'm never going to pressure you to say you have to do this. But at the end of that conversation, at the end of that cup of coffee, you're going to know exactly what you can do and what you can do to help your family.
Yeah. And you also, your firm, if you take on a case, you take it on contingency, don't you?
Absolutely.
Meaning that there's no money that anybody pays you unless you are successful in settling or winning the case.
If I don't win that case or I don't settle that case, even if I spent thousands of dollars preparing it, you don't owe me a dime.
Now, in this area, your firm specializes a lot in these type of cases.
We do.
So you must have, you know, a lot of people that come to you, unfortunately, with claims. How do you select the cases that your firm finally decides to pursue?
Well, it's based upon, as we discussed earlier, it's based upon a review of the medical records.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that the disease that you think you have, or that your doctor, even your local doctor, says you have,
right?
We'll vet that through. We'll have that reviewed by an expert pulmonologist,
right,
or even an oncologist or a pathologist, so that when we proceed with your case, there's never a question as to what is wrong with you and its relationship to asbestos. And then, of course, we'll talk to you at length about your work history.
Yeah.
You mentioned Mr. Grimes, about how it is you were exposed, whether it's in a military setting in the Navy, or whether it's in any type of occupational setting, or as we opened up about a bystander setting of some type.
You know, I want to thank you for doing the work that you do.
Thank you.
We've done a lot of these stories, and it's always the lawyer that we admire the most that takes their time and their money and pursues justice on behalf of these people. So this show to us is dedicated to you, your law firm, and the Williams family.
Thanks, Steve.
I want to thank you for being on the show.
Thank you for taking the time to spend with me.
Okay, good. Well, I like Lake Charles. Thanks for joining us. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at InsiderExclusive.com.